Okay, so talking about green decks. The green decks. We'll start, of course, with the Monument. This Monument is a pretty strong one that doesn't get used all that much in ranked, but it can be very good in draft. And it is a 3/3 Gem Blade that is basically a land unless you have 5 power. So, like the other ones, you definitely do want to pay attention. It's good in a fully green deck. It's good in a deck where you want equipment that is, and you want a high density of equipment, but you don't necessarily need to get to 8 power. This card is solid in draft. I don't see it too much in ranked, but it does have a place in ranked, and it works pretty well with some cards like, well, some of the green cards that are flying and lifelink and have endurance. A lot of green flyers really like this card. Green has a pretty high flying sub-theme, and that's pretty important. Especially if you talk about green in general. Green is Justice. The closest equivalent in Magic would probably be the white, but basically what they have is they have a lot of sort of very solid creatures that like to be very well balanced and like to have a decent amount of defense in their lineup. I think that's a good way to list it. So Warcry and Aegis are both very common in green. Endurance is fairly common. And you'll see essentially a lot of cards that are pretty good at just basically being relatively aggressive, but not as aggressive as a red card might be. And the way that they are aggressive is usually by being pretty tough and hard to kill, while also benefiting each other and making the other cards in your deck better. Yeah, they have a pretty heavy flying sub-theme, so that tends to work out pretty well in their favor. So you'll see a lot of really good statted green flyers, and those cards are really lovely. Gilded Glaive is a power surge, so when it's played, spends all of your remaining power to give a unit attack and toughness equal to your power. This card is similar to Flame Blast, only it gives you a somewhat permanent bonus. I think it's pretty strong in both standard and draft. In draft, it's definitely just a complete blowout, because if you stick it on a creature on turn 7 or 8, then you have a creature that is now an 11/11. And if that creature had a cool ability before, man, does it have a lot of good stuff going on with it now. This card works well with Aegis creatures. This card works well pretty much all the time. It does have the same basic problem with hard removal as any weapon does, and it doesn't do anything to detract from that, unlike some other weapon options that'll give you creatures or give you some form of protection from a Death Strike or an Annihilate. This card just gives you straight up power, and it gives it to you in a pretty surprising and interesting way. Usually won't play it at the low costs, you only play it at the high costs. I think it's fairly strong. Detain, give an enemy unit -6 this turn. This is a decent combat trick in draft. It's absolutely not playable in standard. Essentially, you can use it to exchange creatures with someone and win a fight in the same way that you can with a Rapid Shot or a Rampage or a Finest Hour. But the main problem is that sometimes this card doesn't actually win you that fight, and sometimes all it does is just make an enemy unit only mildly sad. You can definitely use it in draft to make sure that you get favorable trades, and for that reason, it's a decent low pick in draft. But probably don't run it in ranked unless you don't have better options. District Infantry, 1/1, empower +2/+2 this turn. This card is a really aggressive, and it tends to work out pretty well when you are attacking with it. Hold on a second, let me close the door. Okay, so yeah, this card is very good and aggressive in draft. The obvious weakness is that it is not very strong sometimes, and it's also sometimes pretty. It's very vulnerable to small spells, including things like Piercing Shot, things like Temper. Snowballs are pretty common, and if you play a snowball and kill a district infantry, you're well ahead. And obviously, like, the early aggression eventually begins to peter out as you sort of run out of power in your hand, and then it becomes just kind of this 1/1 that's sitting on the board, like, wondering what it's doing with its life. It can be a really good way to add a lot of aggression to your deck. It does eventually start to not give you advantage. So if your opponent can just wait this out and like gain enough life, then this card doesn't do a lot. It's a very strong to middling pick and draft. If you're playing it in green aggression, you have to be an incredibly aggressive standard deck. And but then it's just yeah, it is a chump. So it doesn't really do much at that point. It is a good card, and you will definitely want it. You might want to pick one in draft. You might want to pick several in draft. You probably don't want like 6 or 7. At some point, it's going to get not good. Elder Feather, +1/+1 in flying. For a weapon, this card is surprisingly strong. It looks like it's not much, and that is one of the more deceiving cards that you can actually find in Eternal. Like, this card really does a lot of work. It basically makes one particular card invulnerable and extremely aggressive. It's very surprising. It interacts very well with Warcry, which is something that you'll see a lot of course. So, like, if you just pull this card out of after it's been Warcried like 3 or 4 times, and it's like a +4/+4 flying, that makes it pretty strong. And since you can play it at just about any time to get a creature through a block, that makes it surprisingly good at being aggressive. If the creature gets killed, then that's bad news for you, and you do end up in a pickle. But this card was actually so strong at common that they had to move it up to uncommon so that you saw it less in draft, because it is a very strong card in draft, and it's a pretty strong card in Recano Standard, where Warcry is a very popular archetype. Finest Hour, give a unit +3/+3 this turn. This is a really strong combat trick and probably sets the bar for combat tricks as far as combat tricks go. Because this is a fast spell, you can use it in response to someone trying to torch your creature, and that's one of the reasons to keep it in a deck. In addition, it allows you to trade with other creatures. It allows you to create like really favorable trades where you sometimes get 2-for-1s. Sometimes this card can generate more value than just trading it for a creature. And that makes it really strong. It's a very good pick in draft. You should get as many of these as you can if you're running green. I mean, don't like run 8, but certainly always try to get them because they are really, really good. It does not see as much play in Standard, but it is entirely strong and a very solid choice, especially if you're starting to like run into a lot of red decks that are running torches. Yeah, like all combat tricks, the only thing that really makes this risky is other combat tricks. If you play a combat trick and your opponent plays a better one, then life's sad for you. But for the most part, Finest Hour doesn't really have that kind of interaction. It gives all-around power and toughness. It's very strong. Inspire. The top unit or weapon of your deck gets +1/+1, similar to any Warcry effect, and you draw that card, or you draw a card, which doesn't actually necessarily have to be the top unit or weapon of your deck. Several Inspires chained together can create a surprisingly strong creature very early on. This card is a really good filler card if you're not really sure what else to put in your deck, or if you're like short a slot, because what it does and what it adds to your deck is actually not bad. If you're just like missing something to do on turn 1, then Inspire is a really great card, and I think that in general you should pick it in draft and standard for exactly that reason. Obviously this card does some good things, the same things that Warcry does, and it does them without having to attack. So it can really generate a lot of power for your side. There's another card that is the equivalent of this, which is Tinker Apprentice, and whether or not you're running that or Inspire depends on what kind of deck you're running. But both are pretty strong. Protect. Give a unit or a player an Aegis. This card is surprisingly good. It's probably not as good as Finest Hour in most instances, especially not in draft. In Standard, I think it gets used more than Finest Hour. And it's a similarly great combat trick. It can do all sorts of things, and since it can also protect you, the player, from cards like Burnout, the card that sacrifices to deal 5 damage to you, or from extremely powerful spells like Channel the Tempest or Pyroblast, this card can actually be a pretty decent, like 1 or 2 of, or maybe even a 3 or 4 of. It's very good if you want to keep one particular unit alive. You do have to wait 1 extra turn to play this unit, because you want to have the protect up, but yeah, like in general, this card really just does a good job at foiling your opponent's removal spells and making sure that you keep creatures on the board continually attacking, which is what green really likes to do. Steadfast Deputy, 1 cost, 1/1 with Aegis. This card is surprisingly hard to kill, and it is also one of the cards that you can play that is the most likely to get ignored. Like, you will almost never see this card killed turn 1, which means that it's a pretty good guy to put any kind of weapon on. He doesn't get used much in Standard, he doesn't get used much in Draft. There are places for him, though, and he is super aggressive. He works pretty well with Paladin Oathbook, and he works pretty well with anything that's going to be stacking a lot of Aegis creatures. If you're playing like a ton of Aegis creatures, just even tiny Aegis creatures, and giving them buffs, that deck is very strong and has a place in the meta that isn't really being utilized right now. Tinker Apprentice, 1/1, give a unit or weapon in your hand, +1/+1. This card can sometimes whiff, and that makes it a little worse than Inspire sometimes. But it is a sizable body, and the fact that it gives you a choice of what unit or weapon to put +1/+1 on means that it can be a better activator for certain things. This card measures up pretty well with Inspire as something to put into your deck to make the rest of your deck stronger. Green just has really good choices in 1-drops, and both of these are pretty solid. Valkyrie Aspirant, flying, pay 8 to give it +4/+4. A pretty strong card in Draft, and a card that sees a lot of use in Standard as a result of it being flying. There's a deck called Flight School that really loves this card. It's not really strong in Standard apart from Flight School, which is a deck that cares so much about flyers that it'll run a 1-drop flyer. But I think that the fact that it is a 1/1 for 1 that can also be a 5/5 for 9 is really not terrible. Gives it a decent amount of versatility. It's not as good as Pyro Knight or Xenon Guardian for that versatility, but these cards are very strong in Draft generally, and it can definitely be pretty good to put a sword on and just keep alive for most of the game. Arsonport Soldier, 3/2 for 2. It is the super vanilla 2-cost card. You don't see it in Standard very much, because there's some more interesting archetypes, of course, and Standard decks are always trying to do something really crazy or difficult, and vanilla 3/2s don't really help out with that. But this card really does shine in Draft. It's probably the strongest 2-drop in Draft, and you can certainly play it pretty much any time. If you need to fill a 2-drop slot, this is the right choice. Crownwatch Commando, 2/2. When you play a weapon on it, it gets flying and lifesteal this turn. I haven't seen this in Standard in a while, which doesn't mean that it doesn't have a place, but I think it's more likely to get killed than some of the other things that you can get weapons on, and therefore Standard decks don't like it that much. You should pick it in Draft only if you have weapons, because it's strictly worse than Argenport. Is a 3/2 better than a 2/3 in general? Debatable. It depends really on what you're looking for. I find that both of them die to torches really easily, so being aggressive is kind of nice. There are certainly situations where a 2/3 is better than a 3/2, but I think both of those two, both the 3/2 and the 2/3, are the strongest of the 2-drops in of the vanilla. Yeah, they're both very strong vanilla 2-drops, and they work pretty well in Draft. But yeah, like in general, putting your opponent on a more aggressive clock. Aggression is usually better than defense in any card game. Like, unless your defense, if the stats are even, then you want to go for the aggression, I guess, would be what I say. Like, obviously you can like pick a card that is more efficient and also defensive, but the reason that those cards are so efficient is because what they do is they stall out the game and allow your opponent to draw more cards that might win him the game, and that doesn't really necessarily work very well for you in terms of advantage. So you have to be careful with defensive creatures, and in the basic comparison, I think Argenport Soldier comes out well ahead. Yeah, Crown Watch Commando is solid with weapons in draft. It's pretty okay with weapons in standard, but doesn't see a lot of play. Crown Watch Longsword, 2/2 weapon for 2. It is quite good in draft. It is a good pile of stats early enough on that you don't usually see the huge disadvantage that you have from equipping like a big weapon on a big creature and then like getting blown out by removal. The fact that it happens so early and then like makes your creature usually torch-proof means that it's not bad in draft, and tends to be something that people really have to deal with. You end up with like a 5/4 Argenport Soldier, and that card is hard to kill. Like, it's really hard to kill, and it's really hard to kill at 3 mana. So this card does end up seeing a lot of use in draft. A little less in standard, but because it synergizes well with Warcry, it's still a solid choice. The main reason that it doesn't see play in standard is because there is a card called Morningstar, which is a hybrid card that is a 3/2 for 2, and as a result, Crown Watch Longsword kind of falls behind. But if you're in mono green, this is the alternative. Crown Watch Paladin, Warcry Aegis, 2/2. This card is one of the best 2-drops. This one and the 2/2 with Quick Draw and Warcry are both like standard in Rakano decks, and the main reason is because this card is just insanely hard to kill, and usually gets a decent amount of benefit when it gets some kind of weapon. The great advantage to any Aegis creature is that if you're playing a deck that uses a lot of weapons, what usually happens with weapons is that weapons exchange 2 for 1, because you put a weapon on a creature, the creature dies to something, and then your opponent has spent 1 card and you've spent 2. With Crown Watch Paladin, you put a weapon on Crown Watch Paladin, your opponent has to pop the Aegis somehow, then he kills the Crown Watch Paladin, you've exchanged your cards 2 for 2, and you've been aggressive the whole time, so you're getting the Warcry benefit. That makes Crown Watch Paladin extremely strong in standard. In draft, it can actually sometimes be weaker than Argenport Soldier, just because removal doesn't happen as much in draft, but there is still removal in draft, and this card is still really strong. The Warcry is quite good. If you are playing in draft, you might consider favoring Minotaur Grunt over this, but it's questionable. This card is still really good, and if you have equipment, you should definitely pick it. Eager Owlet, a 0/3 that has 3 attack when you have another flying unit. You'll rarely see this in draft, mostly because it's rare, but also because you really have to be in flyers for this to work. If you like flyers in standard, this card is really good. It's a 3/3 for 2. It usually doesn't end up being, it usually ends up like needing to be killed, as opposing to having all the other flyers around it killed. And it's so well statted for a 2-cost card when that happens that standard decks that love flyers really love it. Yeah, this is a nice aggressive card. The drawback is pretty obvious. It's sometimes just kind of a wall that blocks like 1/1s and 2/1s. That's not usually too bad to have. Still dies to Torch, so not the strongest of flyers, but it's good enough, and definitely you will see it in Flight School decks. Minotaur Grunt, 1/3 with Warcry. This card is similarly survivable to Crown Watch Paladin, similarly equipable to Crown Watch Paladin. You will see it more commonly in draft, and you will see it less commonly in standard than Crown Watch Paladin. The two of them measure up pretty closely. Minotaur Grunt has like a little bit less attack, and that's kind of relevant some of the time. The nice thing about him is that he does block Oni Ronins. He does do a lot of like the cool blocking that 1/3s get to do, and being able to block an Oni Ronin is actually pretty relevant in quite a few decks. Pretty strong pick in draft. Yeah, Paladin Oathbook. When you attack the enemy player with exactly 1 unit, it gets +1/+1. This card's very strong. It is a relic. It has the disadvantage of in some standard decks, if you're playing out a lot of creatures, then this card is not benefiting you quite as well as it could be, because sometimes you're going to be wanting to attack with all of those creatures, and in that case, Oathbook isn't going to do a thing. However, if you're playing, like, say, a Steadfast Deputy into a Paladin Oathbook, that gets you a 2/2 with Aegis straight away. That's not a bad deal. If you're playing like a Crown Watch Paladin, and then you Oathbook and make that into a 3/3, and you're equipping it, and all of that stuff is happening, Oathbook just makes every card a threat, and that makes Oathbook really, really scary. It sees just a little bit of play in Standard, not a lot, but it is a pretty nice relic, and one of the stronger relics at 2. In Draft, it's just amazing. Yeah, really good uncommon to pick. Rebuke, silence and stun a unit. This is bad removal. It's a decent silence effect, but obviously it's card disadvantage because it doesn't get rid of the unit, and it doesn't take the unit off the board. So if your opponent's just running some like decently statted creatures, then Rebuke is just kind of there. It's okay in Draft. I almost never see it run in Standard because the alternative is Vanquish, and Vanquish tends to be a lot more reliable, or not reliable, but yeah, it just tends to hit a lot more stuff that you actually want to kill. Reinforce, you gain 4 armor. This is a weapon supportive deck. A card that supports weapons, because when you have armor, it makes it so your weapons don't break as easily. It's not very good. There's a comparative card that is, I think, the next card on the list, that is a little bit better, but only provides half the armor, and that card is Roland's Favor. This one will work okay in some decks, and if you're really trying to get that armor early on, then you can run it. It's not good in Draft at all. I guess if you had like a lot of weapons, if you had if you somehow managed to build armory in Draft, then you could run this, because it's a poor man's substitute for Roland's Favor. First Rebuke or third Finest Hour? I'd take the third Finest Hour. Yeah. Straight up. Finest Hour is a card that I would love to have 3 of. Okay, Roland's Favor. 2 armor, draw a Justice Sigil from your deck. Here we go. This card is better than Reinforce, and the reason for that is because it gets you another card. So all it's doing is giving you 2 armor and drawing you something new. Good way to get power. It's a good way to get yourself up to the higher level weapons. So as a result, it sees a lot of play in Standard. It's okay in Draft. Obviously, relic weapons like make this more relevant. And if you don't have relic weapons, then this card is really pretty bleh as mana fixing, but it's okay. Yeah, the other thing about this is that 2 armor is the relevant amount for Armor Smith, which is a 4-cost card that cares whether or not you have 2 armor. So yeah, this card is decently strong, and will see Standard play in Armory decks. And does see Standard play in Armory decks. Don't really want to pick it in Draft highly, but it is a good fixer. Tinker Overseer, flying. When you play a relic, Tinker Overseer gets +1/+1. This card works well with Paladin Oathbook. It's a decently statted flyer that can get more decently statted. It's a little bit on the weak side, but the ability to get stronger does work out pretty well. And the fact that it's flying and hard to deal with means that it's not bad and sees play in both Standard and Draft. Like, in Draft, a 2/2 flyer is just quite alright. In Standard, a 2/2 flyer is really not that great, but you're probably playing relics with it, so that's pretty good. Vanquish, 2-cost, kill a unit with 4 attack or more. Yeah, this card is good. If a unit has 4 attack or more, it's either something you really want to get rid of, or it's a card that's got a weapon on it, which means it's a 2-for-1. So yeah, Vanquish is solid in Draft and Standard. It obviously falls flat on its face if you run into like a red-black deck that's just like running nothing but 2/2s and 3/3s. And since it's not a fast spell, it doesn't even get to hit Bandit Queen, which is a card that is a 3/2 that gets a +1 bonus for 1 turn. Yeah, so, but in general, this card is really good if you're running into a lot of mid-range in green, and right now it's making pretty much all of the Elysian mid-range decks miserable in Standard. So, yeah, it's a good pick in Draft. I would definitely go ahead and pick it up if you can. Oh my goodness. Water. Yeah, that's better. Auric Sentry. 1/5 Endurance Warcry. This card sees play in Standard. It's tough enough that it's hard enough to kill that it is the most consistent way to generate war cries that you can think of. And generating a lot of war cries, like every turn, is really quite good. If you stick like a Crown Watch Longsword on this, then it's almost invulnerable in draft. And as a result, you will just like continue to attack and then play out bigger and bigger creatures. This card is very good at just like generating that much power. Its obvious weakness is that it doesn't really have a lot of attack, but for the most part, it's decently strong. You do really have to make it better over time, and that means playing things like Elder Feather, playing things like Crownwatch Longsword and Morningstar, and when that happens, there is the opportunity to have card disadvantage imposed upon you. So you have to watch out for it, and you have to take care of it, but your Auric Sentry can be your friend. It's a better card in draft than Standard, but it's usable in Standard. Bright Mace Paladin, 3/3, has lifesteal when he has 4 or more. This card is really good in draft. This card is almost never used in Standard, because lifesteal is just not as good in Standard. But yeah, like the ability to have a big giant creature with lifesteal is quite nice, and it tends to work out pretty well for Bright Mace Paladin. This card really loves to just tilt in for 5 or 6 and then gain 5 or 6 each turn until it's eventually dealt with. And yeah, there are a lot of different ways to give it power 4 or more in green. Not just weapons, but also War Cries, Inspire, Tanker Apprentice. There are so many cards that make this card much better, and you will find all of them in the common section of a draft. So this card is a great draft pick because it's very well statted, and it usually becomes even better. Bronze Cuirass, +0/+6. Weapon? I think there's a place for this card, actually, but it's not very good in Standard, and it's only okay in draft. The fact that it makes a creature unkillable is pretty nice in draft. Like, this is just horrendous if you're building a battlecruiser. But for the most part, this weapon is pretty skippable, and you should look at other weapons first. Yeah. But yeah, not by and large all that good a card, but kind of interesting and fun. Emerald Acolyte, 2/1, you gain 3 armor. Doesn't see play in Standard. It's similar to the Reinforce. This card is probably not pickable in draft unless you've somehow drafted a billion relic weapons, in which case you're very happy to have it. It does give you a bit of survivability as well as being a 2/1. It's definitely strictly better than Reinforce, even though it costs a little bit more. I think this card is interesting to activate cards like Armorsmith. You won't see it in Armory decks, it's just a little too slow and doesn't do quite enough, and the stats are pretty bad, but nonetheless, it's okay. And you might see it if someone is very concerned about armor, such as like having a Plated Demolisher deck. I've never seen a Plated Demolisher deck, but I would totally build one, and if I did, it would probably have Emerald Acolytes. Yeah, okay. Hero of the People, 1/1, when you play a unit, Hero of the People gains its battle skills. Hero of the People has +1/+1 for each of her battle skills. So the battle skills are Flying, War Cry, Lifesteal, Quick Draw, Endurance. I believe there are 15 of them in all. There might be a few less. I think there are only 15 skills in all, so battle skills is slightly less than that. You can have maybe 10 or 12. Flying, War Cry, Lifesteal, Endurance, Aegis, Killer. Yeah, so there are plenty of different things that Hero of the People can get. And here's the rule about Hero of the People. If you see a Hero of the People on the board, it has to die. Like, that is just the rule with Hero of the People. If you leave Hero of the People on the board for more than one turn, Hero of the People will become the most disgusting monstrosity you've ever seen. The most common thing to do with Hero of the People is to play Hero of the People and then immediately spiral into Silverwing Familiar, and therefore give it Flying, Lifesteal, Aegis so that it can't be killed by spells, and also it's a 4/4. That's pretty rough, and then it starts getting Endurance, then it starts getting card, like Deadly or Killer or Quick Draw. If it gets War Cry, it can become just really, really bad for you. Hero of the People is a great standard card. It's also a pretty good draft card, but you do have to keep an eye on how many skills are in your deck. The deck that is built around Hero of the People is obviously going to be a little bit slow. It might not even want to play Hero of the People on turn 3. It might want to wait until like turn 6, because playing a 4/4 with Lifesteal Flying and Aegis on turn 6 that also is going to get some other skills is still not bad. Yeah, this card is decent in Standard. It's definitely good in Draft. Just, draft around it. Huru Envoy. When a spell is played directly on Huru Envoy, draw a card. This card does not like to be removed, and that makes it kind of fun to put weapons on. It doesn't have a standard deck built around it yet. I've tried a few. It's maybe not quite good enough. I don't think it was a 2/1 last time I checked. I think that maybe it got a stat boost. So that's kind of interesting. Yeah, it's not a very good card, and I think it might be okay in Draft if you're running equipment, because obviously it, like, even more so than other cards, is pretty annoying to kill. It's always going to get you a card back. By and large, this card doesn't do a lot, but there are some cool things you can do with it. It chains well with cards like Levitate that give your creature flying and draw you a card. Anything that you can do that gives it a buff, like Accelerated Evolution, makes it kind of neat. There are tons of interesting possibilities with this card, but the stats are pretty weak, so it hasn't seen standard play yet. Yeah, but you can definitely try it out in Draft if you get it. It's a cool rare. Loyal Watchwing, 1/1 flying Warcry. This card is okay. I like it okay in Draft. I like it okay in Standard. The stats are pretty bad. The Warcry is pretty good. The fact that it can usually consistently get you a Warcry is very nice. It's a good card to put weapons on. It's a good card to give Warcries to, because it becomes a really nice flyer at that point. But it doesn't do a lot. It's very middle of the road in both Standard and Draft. And you will see it in Flight School decks, of course, because Flight School decks are playing pretty much everything flying that they can. And this card is still just fine in there. Order of the Spire. Empower. Double Order of the Spire's power and toughness. What a beating this is in Draft. This is not a good card in Standard, but you can build a Standard deck around it. It's best to figure out a way to play this card and get a bunch of power out at the same time. There aren't that many ways to do that in Standard just yet, but yeah. This is the way that you get the achievement for reducing your opponent to negative 999 life, because it turns out doubling something multiple times is really powerful when it comes to stats. This card is actually really exciting in that respect, and there are a couple of ways that you could build a Standard deck around it that wouldn't be bad. You could use it as a starting Standard card. It definitely does a lot of neat things. I haven't seen it in Standard in a very long time because it gets silenced too easily and it's just a little slow. You play Order of the Spire as a 4-drop. You play it at 3 and then you play a power. You very rarely play Order of the Spire on 3 because the stats on it are absolutely abysmal that way and it doesn't really do anything. Privilege of Rank. Draw 2 Justice Sigils from your deck. If it's discarded, play it. Not only is this card actually pretty decent for mana search, sometimes there are things that you actually want to do on turn 3, but if there aren't, then this is a good way to just guarantee your next 2 power drops, and that's not bad. But this card also interacts really interestingly with green-blue decks, and with certain other decks. There aren't that many ways to make it trigger yet, but it has seen a little bit of Standard play. I would play it in Draft. I think that the fact that it gives you those 2 power is actually not bad, and it's probably worth playing. As a rare, you won't see it very often, of course, but yeah, it's not bad. It's a 2-for-1 card advantage. It essentially draws you a card. That card is always a power, but it's also a power from your deck, so it thins it out. Yeah, it's reasonable. Silverwing Familiar, Flying, Lifesteal, and Aegis. This card is not very good by itself, but it's one of the best things to put weapons on ever, and it's really fairly annoying, and people want to kill it a lot, so that's kind of nice. Yeah, this card is pretty strong. for a lot of different reasons, and you'll see it in Standard, not just in Hero of the People decks, but also in certain weapon decks, in Flight School decks, in, yeah, several different decks. It's got very, very, very good skills, and if there's any way to make it more powerful, like Warcry also works, Inspires, and Tinker Apprentices, yeah, anything that makes it larger makes it very, very scary. It takes 2 cards to kill, and that's always wonderful. Yeah, it's gonna do pretty well against anything that isn't a killer creature, so it's good stuff. Spire Chaplain, 3/2. When it attacks, draw a Justice Sigil from your deck. Very good draft card, reasonable standard card. The consistent power is really nice. The stats aren't bad. 3/2 for 3 is a little bit weak, but it's still a card that usually ends up trading with something, so that's kind of nice. If this card gets removed, you're a little bit sad, but for the most part, it's just kind of nice to have something there that demands attention. It doesn't see a lot of play in Standard, but it can. There's nothing particularly wrong with it, and if you're trying to get like sort of a late game strategy going, then you could definitely run with this card. There's a lot of interesting things to do at 3 in green though, so as a result, you're not going to see too much of it in Standard. Treasury Guard, 2/3 Endurance. This card is really, really basic and doesn't see a lot of play. Not even sure I would recommend it in draft. The Endurance is nice. Like, it's actually a decent common creature, so if you're trying to fill a 3 slot, this is probably one of the better statted creatures that you can get. In Standard, it's just not going to do anything. Don't play it in Standard. The Endurance is only okay if you're trying to do something with Endurance, and there are better Endurance cards out there. But yeah, it can wear pants. I think in comparison to Auric Sentry, this card is almost strictly worse. Valkyrie Enforcer, 3/3 flying. Summon, you may silence another unit. What a beating. This is a very, very good card, and probably the best 3-slot drop that you can run. As a 3/3 flyer, that's really not bad for stats, and the silence effect is also very powerful. It's double in green, so you have to be careful to be running enough green to run it, but it is a standard staple, and it's also very strong in draft. It's a really good card, and definitely one of the top tier cards in the green set. Valorous Stranger. Strangers have Warcry. I've built a draft deck with 6 of these. Not sure how I got 6 of them, but I did build that deck. It went like 2/2. Yeah, the benefit of this card is pretty questionable. You can make it work, but your opponent really has to kind of drop the ball for that to happen. So it's not particularly good. I would run it in draft. I would almost never run it in Standard, but then again, getting Strangers to work in Standard hasn't really happened yet. I think once a Stranger Lord of some kind, or Queen, or whatever the big Stranger is going to be, I'm sure it'll be a promo card of some kind. Whenever that happens, you can reevaluate. Strangers are only going to get better, and at that point, this card, we can take a look at it again. But right now, it's not playable in Standard. It's an okay card in draft, and only if you have Strangers. Armorsmith. 4 mana, you gain 2 armor. It's free if you already have 2 armor. That's kind of cool, and it's a pretty solid staple for an armory deck. The card this is most often used with is Sword of Ikaria, a 3/2 with Warcry that is a relic weapon. So essentially you equip a 3/2 with Warcry, Armorsmith drops for free and makes it a 3/4 with Warcry, and then you spend your Warcry killing something that's like a 3/3, and you still have another swing. That's pretty good card advantage. That makes Armorsmith pretty strong. This card is quite good in Armory. I think Armory decks could actually stand to run without it sometimes. Maybe that's blasphemy, but it could happen. And yeah, like, it's very strong in Standard. It's got some potential to be in some other decks where you do stuff like just generate armor and then like rush out with tiny creatures. The free part of it is kind of interesting, and that makes it potentially available to a couple of other decks. But right now it's only in Standard in the Armory list. It's not that great in draft, the stats aren't good, and the armor bonus is questionable, but I mean, if you have Sword of Icarias and you have several of them, then Armor Smith is certainly a good addition, and you can do that combo without being an armory deck. So that's not bad. Auric Runehammer. This is a super strong weapon. +4/+1, you're invulnerable to damage this turn. The nice thing about this is that most weapons, you can play them, and then you get torched to the face, and the weapon never attacks. Auric Runehammer always gets what it's going for. Like, if there's a creature on the ground that has 4 toughness, Auric Runehammer is going to kill it. And that's actually really nice. Like, that makes it a very reliable way to deal damage to a creature. In addition, since it, like, is a reliable way to deal damage to a creature, you kill a creature, and then your opponent is forced to attack into you because Auric Runehammer is there. So if you already have a commanding board position, Auric Runehammer is a great win more card. If you're in a fairly weak board position, then at least this card is a removal spell. Yeah, this card is strong in draft, and it's very strong in standard as well. Good card at 4. Blinding Burst. You and your units are invulnerable to damage this turn. Doesn't see as much play in standard, but it's a really good trick. It's a very, very powerful effect that can be just a sweeper. It'll protect you. It's got some versatility. It'll protect you from like pyroblasts and other things, but because it's a fast spell. But the cost is pretty prohibitive, so you can't really rely on that happening. Mostly what happens is you declare a giant attack with this, then you Blinding Burst, and everything goes wrong for your opponent all at once. That makes it a very good card in draft. It does not see that much play in standard because it's too expensive for a combat trick, but it can because that blowout effect is really good, so as a one-of, it might not be a bad idea. Combre Magister. Empower invulnerable to damage this turn. This card is good in draft. This card is bad in standard. And the reason for that is because torches exist, and as long as torches exist, lots of decks will have them. Plus, there are lots of other like good removal spells that can kill Combre Magister the turn you play it before it does anything cool. But in draft, like your opponent is much less likely to have a torch. He's also much less likely to have any other kind of removal, and this card like has a really sort of commanding amount of attack, so it can continually attack into your opponent and make his life miserable. At the point where it doesn't have an Empower, it still manages to do a trade of some kind. That makes it okay in draft. Okay. We'll do the rest of the 4s, but I'm getting a little stuffed up, so after that I'll have to take a quick break, and then we'll probably go back to drafting. Copperhall Recruit, 2/5, Minotaur. This card is really, really basic. It's okay to run in draft, but not like anything great. It's definitely not good in standard. Just basic, statted card, move on. Crownwatch Cavalry, 2/2, give one of your other units Crownwatch Cavalry's attack and toughness. This card can be very, very strong, and the reason for that is that war cries often make Crownwatch Cavalry, like, kind of really big. In addition, it usually, even as, like, a vanilla 2/2, gives you a decent amount of stats for its cost. It's a 4/4 for 4, right? Except the stats are divided up, which is even better. It's a good way to activate a lot of stuff. It's a good way to make Warcry decks work really interestingly, where like the card that's doing all of the work gets rewarded with a giant boost from the Crownwatch Cavalry. So it's like, hey, you've done all like 7 of those Warcries, have a 9/9 power bonus. That's pretty decent. Yeah, this card is okay. It's definitely good in draft. Hasn't seen a lot of play in standard, but it's fine, and if you're running a Warcry deck, that's where it goes. Hammer of Might. Summon Warcry 3 this turn. This is a swing, this is a beating. This sees a little bit of play in standard, and it's definitely good in draft. The stats on it are decent and make something torch-proof. The Warcry effect always happens, I believe. I don't think your opponent gets a chance to remove it before it attacks and Warcries for 3, so at the very least you're giving +3/+3 to the top card of your deck. That makes it pretty relevant, and that makes this card quite okay. I would run this deck in some standard decks that haven't run it yet. This card might be a little bit of hidden tech, but the stats on it are only okay, and there's a reason it kind of gets passed over. I'd rate it sort of pretty highly in Standard, and yeah, you should definitely consider running this in Draft, because even though the Warcry 3 only happens once, it's a really powerful effect. Mantle of Justice, +1/+1 for each of your green influence. I haven't seen this card in Standard for a while. I haven't seen it in Draft for a while. I think it's pretty awkward, but the ability that it gives is not bad. It's mostly kind of having problems competing with Gilded Glaive. Like, it's just almost strictly worse than Gilded Glaive because it doesn't have versatility, and also it cares about green influence, so you can't run it in hybrid decks. As a result, it doesn't see any standard play, but if you were running mono green, you could double up on this and Gilded Glaive, and that would be a bad idea because you'd lose a lot at card advantage. Yeah, that's, that's basically the reason why this card isn't good, but the beating that it gives is not bad, and it does give you a lot of toughness and survivability. Yeah, so pretty skippable, but you never know. This one could show up sometime. Overdrive, give a unit +4/+4 this turn, ready at the end of turn. So one-time endurance plus a decent bonus. That makes it okay for Draft. It's almost unplayable in Standard. Yeah, I'd say it's completely unplayable in Standard. The +4/+4 is one of the highest bonuses that you can get, and the ready at end of turn is a nice effect, but it's not a fast spell. And it costs too much, so it's not really all that great for what you're trying to do. You can maybe do it in like a Huru Envoy deck? I don't really see it though. Yeah, as far as I know, this card is just bad. But you can run it in Draft if you're like really short on interesting tricks, or you're running like a lot of flyers. Yeah, that's about the only reason to take an Overdrive. Prosecutor at Arms. Oh, I should mention that this card has a better version of it called Ceremonial Mask at 6. So that's the other reason why this card is not seen. Prosecutor at Arms, +1/+1 for each of your units that died this turn. It's a 3/3. This has never seen play in Standard. You could like Harsh Rule and then Prosecutor at Arms, but I don't know, this card needs something. The art's kind of bad too, actually. Yeah, just like weird guy with green hair and a goatee. What's going on with this guy? Yeah, so this card isn't really great in Draft because it's usually poorly statted and only sometimes gets to be big, and even then it doesn't have any abilities. And this card isn't really very good anywhere else either. This card needs some love, honestly. Like, I don't know why this card exists. I think it's a set 0 card. I'm not sure if you actually get it in packs, but if you do, that's kind of a sad day for you. This card doesn't do anything really very interesting. Oh, it's only each of your units that died this turn. That's even worse. Wow. What could you possibly do to make Prosecutor at Arms good? I don't know. I'm stymied by this design. This is probably like, yeah, this is a very bad card. Poor Prosecutor at Arms. Moving on. Silverwing Avenger, 2/2 flying, give an enemy unit -2. This card is pretty strong in Draft. It doesn't see a lot of play in Standard, but late school decks may consider running it. In general, like the -2 is really relevant in Draft as a minor removal spell. Like it just makes like one of those Oni Ronins or like one of those like flying creatures go away, and that's always nice. The standard version of it, like this really doesn't do enough, and it's usually going to end up like not giving you the advantage that you want, so you won't play it as much. In addition, the stats are actually surprisingly bad for a flyer in green. There are some really well-statted flyers in greens with better effects. So yeah, the standard version of this card doesn't really exist, but very rarely in late school decks you might see it. Yeah, so this card is good in Draft, and a very good pick, and you should run it. Stalwart Shield, Endurance, 1/3. Yeah, this card is still pretty good. I think it used to be a 1/4, and that was nuts. Just like, oh, so powerful. Now it's just really good. It's got a good amount of survivability, the endurance is really relevant, the extra damage is quite okay. The thing that makes this card really interesting and just really excellent is Permafrost, which is a blue card that equips to creatures and stuns them permanently. And if you equip a Stalwart Shield on something, then not only is that creature really tough to deal with, but that creature was probably already something that was really tough to deal with, and you just knocked a Permafrost off it, so you got card advantage out of your equipment. That's really decent. And yeah, this card will see a little bit of play in Standard, not so much right now, because most of the Standard green decks are Rakano, and Rakano has a 4-cost option that gives +4/+4 Overwhelm and Endurance. Yeah, that card is just bonkers, and that card maybe needs to be nerfed, because this card is still pretty okay, and it's a very strong choice in draft. Yeah, you know, I think there are many cards that do like really interesting fun combos, and I'm generally trying to explore the fun combos. I don't know that Prosecutor of Arms has a fun combo. I think I've tried pretty hard to build a Prosecutor of Arms that has a fun combo, but like, what's the fun combo here? Is it like Bloodright Collis? Harsh Rule? People are, yeah, like that seems strange. Like, I can't think of a way to kill all of your creatures beneficially, apart from trading them, at which point Prosecutor Arms is still just kind of okay. Like, maybe the best you could get out of it is a 7/7 that then immediately gets killed in Standard. Like, you can maybe play this card in draft, but that's about it. Tireless Stranger. Strangers have endurance. It's okay. It's another okay Stranger. It's a better Stranger probably than the Warcry one, just because it's a decently statted endurance creature, and that makes it okay in draft. The Warcry one is probably more interesting in Standard, just because endurance on Strangers doesn't really seem all that important, unless you're trying to do the Stalwart Shield thing and slough off Permafrosts. So yeah, doesn't see any play in Standard, but you can run it in draft as a middle-of-the-road creature if you're lacking for 4-drops. Treasury Gate. First time you play a relic weapon each turn, play a Minotaur with the same attack and power and battle skills. Attack and health and battle skills. This card is really quite excellent in relic weapon decks. It generates a lot of card advantage, and it does it in a really spectacular and fun fashion. It's really fun card. Yeah, it's kind of brilliant. I like this card a lot, and it does some really cool things. Very rarely does it give you something with a battle skill. Like, I think you'll get Overwhelm off of Promethean Maul, you'll get Warcry off of Sword of Icaria, but you won't get Lifesteal off of Life Drinker. And I don't think that there is another card that will give you anything. So there's only like 2 battle skills you can currently get with Treasury Gate. This card has potential to be really exciting in set 2. It's already pretty exciting in Armory decks, and it's a way for Armory decks to deal with the problem that they have where they can't quite generate enough power to kill people. Yeah, I think there might end up being some synergies with Prosecutor at Arms. Right now it's not a very good card. Auric Bailiff. Stun an enemy unit with 4 power or more. 3/5. The stats on this are okay. The stats on this make it a very good card in draft. It's too expensive and too weak to do anything in Standard at the moment. But yeah, like at this point, like if you're having problems with units with 4 power or more, the card that you usually want is right next to you, or it's a Vanquish. Yeah, so like Harsh Rule or Vanquish tends to replace this in Standard, but I suppose if you don't have your Harsh Rules yet, you could maybe use this as a way to deal with mid-range decks. Probably not. Yeah, but this card is okay in Standard because the stun effect is pretty powerful, allows you to punch through for a decent amount of damage, and the 3/5 is a reasonable body, so that makes it okay in draft. But not in Standard. Harsh Rule. Kill all units. For 5. And yeah, that's not bad at all. It's a very powerful effect. It's a good control effect. It doesn't go well with a lot of the cards that green really wants to run, but if you're running like it as a splash card in something else, like if you're running, you will usually run control decks in green specifically for Harsh Rule. This card can convince people to commit to some really bad wipes. This card is extremely strong in Standard. This card is extremely strong in Draft. Yeah, it's definitely a card that you want to include if you can get it. The basic idea behind this card is that if you have it in your hand, then you play out as few creatures as possible and try to convince your opponent to play out as many creatures as he can. Then you wipe the board and you start actually playing your own creatures. That's as far as it goes. This card trades 1 for 3, 1 for 4. This card trades all the time for a lot of advantage. And sometimes it just gets rid of one like really big problem creature for you, and that's okay. Yeah, so reset the board. This card has a really strong effect, and that's really what you want to get into. Sorry, I said that I'd stop at 5 because I'm feeling a little congested, so I'm going to stop for a little bit, and we'll draft, and then we'll come back and talk about Ironthorn and the rest. Martial Ironthorn. This is, I think, my favorite legendary. There are a lot of them that I really like, but Martial Ironthorn's design and like the fact that he's like just a weird dude with a shield and a shotgun, I've always kind of liked him. He's got a decent body for 5. 5/5 for 5 is not bad in terms of stats. It's a little bit under curve for some creatures, like if you're in like time, but for the most part, like this is a pretty good block of stats at 5. The Empower ability makes it so that he is usually played as a 6-drop, because his Empower ability is to play an additional copy of any power. So if you drop him down and then you play a Justice Sigil out, then you get 2 Justice Sigil played, you go from 5 mana up to 7 mana. And the synergy with that, of course, is in his own ultimate, which is pay 15 to kill all enemy units. This is a one-sided wrath effect. That means that it's very, very powerful. You can't really play it ever from like 20 power. Like, it's very hard to just like drop Martial Ironthorn and then trigger that. But if you can, then it's actually something that you can't really respond to. It doesn't have a counter effect that you could use. If Martial Ironthorn is played on the board and then uses his ability, you can kill Martial Ironthorn in response, but he will blow the whole board up. So, like, that's a really interesting thing where he, like, has just, like, a commanding presence if you have, like, 20 or more mana, 20 or more power. And, yeah, that's pretty good. The fact that he is, like, a decent mid-range beater who also has, like, a really neat effect that's really fun. It helps you get up to 8s, and then, like, it also, like, can synergize with itself. He has to be dealt with before he gets up to 15 power. All of that's pretty good, and that makes this card, like, a really strong legendary in general. He's just kind of good all around. He's very, like, most of the big creatures, he's very vulnerable to Vanquish. Like, there's a lot of ways that he can just be dealt with, like, very easily, and that generally kind of sucks for him. But he does work well in decks that use Seraph Crownwatch Hero, which is a card that plays free creatures for 8 power, and the Great Parliament, which is a card that plays owls based on the amount of maximum power that you have. You can use him with a New Tomorrow to get like a ridiculous amount of power. You can use him with pretty much any Seek power abilities to get like a ridiculous amount of power. If he's paired with Vodachan, who gives all power Destiny, then the power that gets played draws you extra cards, because each one gets a copy, and then both of them trigger Destiny, so they draw 2 cards, which will very, very quickly run you through your entire deck. And yeah, he also works with Mystic Ascendant in exactly the same way, which is Mystic Ascendant draws a card if you play a power. So he has a lot of synergy with Empower effects, and that's pretty neat. That means that he's got like a lot of different roles in Standard. You can use him for Empower decks, you can use him for like slow-ish mid-range decks that really like Seraph. You can use him for any deck that's just trying to get to like 8 power as fast as possible, so they can channel the Tempest or do something crazy. Martial Ironthorn can actually be run in multiple colors, even though he's a double green splash. I think he'd be a strong pick in draft, just because he does all of the things, and while he's not likely to get you to 15 power in draft, he's just fine there. So yeah, he's very good in pretty much every situation. He doesn't have like a astounding amount of strength, because he's a fairly slow card, but he has a lot of different ways to win you the game, all of which are accessible after he is played. And yeah, while he is a card that doesn't have an immediate impact on the board, he is nonetheless just a big dude that really likes to do lots of fun stuff. Mithril Mace, 3/4 relic weapon. This is not the greatest relic weapon in the game, but it is one that is often fairly likely to get you 2-for-1 card advantage, especially in draft. The fact that it has 4 armor means that it actually is pretty good at picking off 1-drops and 2-drops without actually getting killed. So unless you're getting like completely swarmed out and you're taking more than 4 damage a turn, then this card can really like pick up a couple of cards for you, and that's not bad. If you chain it with some other armor effects, if you chain it with Warcry effects, it gets more and more powerful. The stats are very good once they are boosted, so that means that it works well with Warcries and other things. And it's also at a reasonable cost for a relic weapon of this particular caliber. That makes it a good pick in early decks if you're just looking for like some straight removal. Makes it a good pick in draft. A mediocre pick in draft, but still a pretty good pick. And in Standard you won't see it very much because there are some better options that are going to do more interesting things. But it can see play in Standard. It's pretty rare. Standard is ranked. In ranked, you'll see. I'm going to start using ranked instead of Standard. I have to stop saying Standard because that's wrong. And it just bothers me personally. Okay, Silverwing Commander. Flying Warcry 2, 4/4. This is, yeah. There's a lot of fun things about this card. The Warcry 2 is a very powerful effect. The flying body is very good. It's just outside of torch range, so it doesn't really matter that it's not like a 5/5 or anything for 5. I think that this card actually creates a lot of problems for your opponent. It gets a little outshone by 4th Tree Elder sometimes, but the Warcry 2 is really quite good, and this is a very strong card in draft. You won't see it too much in Standard, but it's meaty enough that you could play it in an early deck before you get like some of your other cards going on. Augmented Form, give a unit +6/+6. This is a fast spell. This card is unique not only because it's like a really weird combat trick, but also because it's a card that is one of the only cards that gives such a substantial bonus to creatures and is still a spell. Keep in mind that Eternal cards all remember their stat changes, so cards like Augmented Form have an interesting niche in any deck that like cares about reanimation or cares about cards getting returned or anything like that. Because when a card dies or gets returned to your hand, it loses any equipment on it. But if you give it Augmented Form, then that card just always has +6/+6. It doesn't matter if it's in the void, it doesn't matter if it's in your hand. So as a result, Augmented Form, the main reason that you're going to run it is to make something that is already like kind of adept at changing zones into something really big. In addition, it's just a blowout in draft because not only is it like a fun combat trick, but it also makes a big creature for you. Like you can trade in a 1/1 for like somebody like may like block with a 4th Tree Elder, for example. Just block your 1/1 with a 4th Tree Elder, and you're like, well, now I've got a 7/7 and that thing's dead. So yeah, this card is really quite good in draft. Not played too much in Standard. There's a Ephemeral Wisp deck that tried it out for a little bit and did okay, but the triple green is actually really restrictive, which means that you're not going to be able to play it on a lot of different creatures. Still, it's not bad. If you were in mono green, I think there would probably be a place for it, but there's not too many mono green decks that care about 6-power spells. Ceremonial Mask, 4/4. Give one of your units +4/+4 this turn. This card is very strong in draft. This card is actually okay in Standard. It doesn't get used very much, but it is okay in Standard. I think Armory decks usually don't care whether or not they have that extra +4/+4 on one of their creatures. They usually just don't have enough creatures. So as a result, you don't see it in a lot of Relic Weapon decks. But the stat boost it gives is pretty substantial. This is an 8-power swing on the turn that it's played, and then the stats on it are also very similar to Mithril Mace, with just a little bit more damage so that they can kill some of the tougher creatures like that Silverwing Commander that we just mentioned. Yeah, this is definitely a good pickup in draft. There isn't a Standard deck that uses it yet. There isn't a ranked deck that uses it yet, but it'll happen. Civic Peacekeeper, 3/3 Empower Stun an enemy unit. Sees almost no play in ranked, but it's a good pick for a 6-drop in draft. The stun effect has like tends to disable blockers for 2 turns when you empower with it. So that means that it's pretty good at just like getting things out of your way and keeping them out of your way. Civic Peacekeeper can keep 2 blockers down as long as you're continually playing power. That's pretty important, and he's also preventing attacks as well. So he generates a lot of advantage in that sense. Yeah, I think he's a very strong card in draft. You won't see him in standard because the stats are too weak. It's too easy for him to get torched, and then you lose out 1 value. Like, you know, a torch is a 1-cost card. If you're spending a 6 to get this down and then something kills it that easily, then it just doesn't do much. 4th Tree Elder. 4/6 flying endurance. This is like your draft bomb that's also strong enough to be in ranked. It's really quite good. It's got enough toughness to be really annoying. It's got enough power to be really annoying. It's just like at that sweet spot in the stat block where it's just one of the more exciting like vanilla beaters that you're running. It's always up to block. It can block everything because it's flying. It's very hard to get past. Basically, you just have to kill this thing with hard removal, because otherwise it's just going to keep pounding your face for 4 every turn, and there's not too much you can do about that. If a creature is larger than 4th Tree Elder, then that kind of sucks, but 4th Tree Elder still has you on a clock, so yeah, this card sees some play in ranked flight school decks, and it is a very, very good pick in draft. It's probably one of the strongest uncommons in draft. And as a 6-drop, it'll wreck people's day. Plated Demolisher, 8/8 for 6. It has endurance, and when you summon it, you gain 2 armor. But at the start of the enemy turn, if you don't have any armor, you have to sacrifice it. So this card is clearly a standard beast. It's probably okay in draft. Yeah, it's pretty good in draft. I mean, it's a big, fat creature that's actually fairly hard to kill. The obvious like weakness to it is that sometimes it dies to like, you know, you getting torched or something getting past your blocks. But really, what's happening here is that your opponent is still always spending some kind of card to actually get that damage and kill the Plated Demolisher. If he's trying to attack with a bunch of creatures into it, then he's still got to, you know, like get past the Demolisher itself, so Demolisher protects the armor that it's giving you. This has a place in Relic Weapon decks. It also has a place in decks that just use it. Because one of the things that's really interesting about it is that it's at the start of the enemy turn as opposed to at the start of your turn. And that's actually pretty relevant because a lot of things that the enemy is going to do to wreck your armor aren't necessarily going to be fast spells. So that means that the enemy can sometimes do things like, oh, I just attack through and get all of your armor, and you're like, okay, well, that really sucks, I don't have any armor left, I'll just take my turn, and I'll cast a Roland's Favor, and get myself a Justice Sigil and 2 armor. And now Plated Demolisher lasts another turn. So if you have a lot of different ways to get the armor effects up, then Plated Demolisher is very, very hard to kill. It's obviously huge, it's one of the best statted creatures in the game, like 6 mana for an 8/8. There's a 5 mana 7/7 that's hybrid. There's a 4 mana 5/6 that's 2-time. This is probably the next biggest thing that you can play, and it's enormous. There aren't any standard decks that are playing it right now, but I think it's just a matter of people not having it. It's not a very common card to craft. I don't think it appeals to people immediately. It does see sideboard in Relic Weapon decks, the Armory deck, which I talk about a lot. And yeah, it's not bad. It's a pretty good card. Retribution. Deal damage to the enemy player for all of the damage you have taken this turn. What a weird spell. What a weird spell. It's very hard to evaluate this card. I have run it, and it's been okay. It can certainly do, like, in the range of 12 to 13 damage and just win a game. It is a rarity to see this card, but now that I think about it, like, against a Rakano Warcry deck, this is, like, kind of an interesting blowout, because you're often, like, trying to race each other, and then your opponent swings in for, like, that last 12, and it's like, I have this Deep Forge Plate monstrosity, like, just, here's, like, my 12 power creatures on the board, here's 12 damage, you're at, like, 1, and I have 4 creatures on the board, and you're like, well, Retribution. The cost of the card is pretty prohibitive, the influence cost of the card is pretty prohibitive, but the card itself is kind of exciting. And while it's very hard to evaluate, I would never run it in draft. You could run it in standard as a meta counter, and it has to be for a very specific set of conditions. It's such a strange card. There's no combo with it yet that I can think of. I don't think there's a way to damage yourself for a sizable amount. But if you're using relic weapons, you can at least like swing your face into something and take a bunch of damage and then retribution. Which yeah, that's not a bad use for it. This card is just oddball, and it is. I do not have a full evaluation for you on it. It can be good. It's probably not. Don't run it in draft. It's well, yeah, it's just not going to do enough damage in draft. Valkyrie Wings, 2/2 Flying Aegis. This card doesn't see play in standard. Often isn't picked very highly in draft, but I think that might be wrong. The Flying Aegis and the 2/2, all of it gives it like a level of evasiveness and invulnerability that is actually pretty tricky. If you have the right creatures for this, then this can be a really powerful blowout. This card doesn't see a lot of use, but I think it is very strong. It's an alternative to like the Elder Feather concept of just giving a creature +1/+1 and flying, and like blowing them out with Warcry creatures. If you're running this in a Warcry deck, then not only does it give it flying, it gives it Aegis and just a little bit of extra power. So this thing is probably going to be like an 8/8 or a 6/6 or something with flying and Aegis, and then you stick it on something and just make it wreck faces. It's not in the ranked meta yet, but it could be. Flight Lieutenant. Your units get flying this turn. 4/4 Empower. Sorry, 4/4. Every time you play a power, your units get flying this turn. For 7, which makes it pretty rough. Like, the stats on this card are very, very weak. The Empower effect is very powerful, but oftentimes you won't see it because this card gets killed a lot. It's also prohibitively expensive. Like, 7 cost for a card, you usually don't want it to be a 4/4. There are some 4/4s that are like 6/6s. There are a lot of like, better statted cards. It can be an okay pick in draft for the same reason Civic Peacekeeper can be an okay pick in draft, in that you just sort of play it down and then it like slowly wins you the game. But Civic Peacekeeper actually usually does more to get past a line of blockers than Flight Lieutenant does. And that's just because Civic Peacekeeper is a little bit earlier to the party, and you aren't dead at that point. I'm not necessarily knocking it for draft. I think it is a good pick if it's like your last pick, or if it's like, if you need a high drop, this card can actually really get the damage across. It doesn't work in standard. Roland's Honor Guard, 6/6 Flying Lifesteal. Absolute beating in draft. The stats on this card are extremely strong, even for a 7. The Lifesteal effect is very strong. It does a lot of damage, and often it's got like some kind of bonus on it as well. If you can get this card out cheaty-faced, then you're in really good shape, because this is one of the better just like sort of vanilla creatures in the game. Right alongside that 4/6. And I say vanilla creatures, but it's, yeah, like one of the better creatures that is only a creature that's attacking and blocking. It's a pretty efficiently statted. The lifesteal effect is relevant, the flying effect is relevant. It tends to win you games as long as it stays on the board, and it's pretty hard to kill. Very good card in draft, sees some play in standard, mostly as like a 1 or 2 drop, maybe a Flight School thing where you cheat it out. Roland the Iron Fist, Endurance. Your green units have Endurance and are invulnerable to damage. This is a 6/6. This card is a complete beating. It's obviously amazing in draft. And as far as standard goes, you don't see that many decks with it, but when it does show up, it really makes everyone's life miserable. Scions are used not that often in ranked, and really if you build the deck around them, they are very good. Roland the Iron Fist is one of those cards that you play it down, and then suddenly like a red or black or... Sorry, a red deck or a time deck or a... Okay, yeah. A time deck or a fire deck is just not going to be able to respond to you at all. Like, unless you can silence this, then it's just game over, and it ends the game. This card really, really hates anything that wants to kill you, and like just with direct damage. If it gets hit by removal, then it's very sad, and that's pretty much it for Roland. But as far as Scions go, he's got one of the more powerful effects. Not too many standard decks with him, obviously. Yeah, just take him in draft. Sword of the Sky King, 8/8 relic weapon. This is the biggest of the relic weapons. And the stats on it are, of course, really ridiculous. It will always trade 2 for 1, usually for some big creatures. Or usually for a big creature and then like a damage spell of some kind. Sometimes it'll trade for more than that. This card not only works in relic weapon decks, but it also works as a like sort of top end for control. So like if you're running a control deck, you might not want to be running Channel the Tempest at the top. You might want to be running this card, because this card is just going to pick off lots and lots of creatures and still be a finisher for you, because it consistently deals 8 damage at a time. So if you're like keeping the board completely clear of creatures, then this thing is what wins you the game. And there is a deck that uses that exact strategy, and I hate it. It's an incredibly annoying control deck that has at least one of these as a possible finisher. Yeah, this card has a lot of different applications in Standard, and it's good enough to be in Draft even at 8 cost. It's an absolute beater, and really just what a fun card, right? Like, you know, there's something to just having like an 8/8 weapon and really swinging in on your opponent. Yeah. Okay, so that's it for the time ones, and we'll go into the primal ones later, but for now we're going to go back to ranked. So, yeah. For the people who are watching this on, like, YouTube videos, thanks for watching.